Hello, welcome back to Franchise and Lows. I started this video over a year ago, and in order to get a little bit more sort of video editing practice in prior to Stuart Jam, which is coming back very soon, and also to finish the video off because there's a new Addams Family movie out, and maybe I might get some clicks. I don't know. Anyway, speaking of clicks, they do some finger clicks in the Addams Family songs, so that's a good segue. Here's the games. We get off to a sort of unusual start with Fester's Quest for the NES. It's a top-down shooter, not entirely unlike the top-down sections of Blaster Master on the same console, but it's oddly... I couldn't really get a grip on it when I was playing. Now, you move incredibly slowly, which I find almost intolerable, because you don't go short distances. The levels seem quite large, it seems quite maze-like, and it would just be, inarguably, unambiguously better if you moved a little bit quicker, but, it's an old game, so I'm going to cut it some slack on that respect. The shooting doesn't feel awesome because basically later quality of life improvements to shooters, like being able to shoot in one direction while moving in another, doesn't seem to be there, and again, it's difficult. I can't really criticize the game for that because it does show its age, and without access to the manual, which I don't have for reasons that I hope are obvious, it's a really difficult game for me to pass, and I didn't really know what I was doing in it. And despite that, I feel even if you don't know what you're doing, there should be some measure of fun you can have, and I didn't really enjoy this one. There seems to be some light sort of RPG elements where you can choose items, and like for example, you can use, say, a lamp sort of thing to light up a dark area. Really rudimentary, adventure-y stuff like that, probably more so than RPG. But overall, it's a really unusual game. It has not bad graphics, I would say, for its sort of era, but you're mostly fighting kind of nondescript blobs and some really weirdly nightmarish boss battles of really creepy looking, almost kind of like kaiju, maybe, sort of like, or what's the word, tokusatsu, is that a thing? Tokusatsu, is that the word? Stuff like Power Rangers or Super Sentai, whatever you want to call it. The monsters look a little bit like that, which is quite fun, because, it gives you the whole Japanese developer aesthetic. But no, I can't really recommend Fester's Quest, I'm afraid. I've played much worse games, but this is not a great start. Okay, this is a weird one. This is Addams Family for the NES, which is very much the prototype for the later SNES game, which is much better, and we'll get to hopefully shortly. This is really hard. I had huge trouble with this. It's the kind of hard that makes you just wonder what they were thinking. And this, not the AVGN, what were they thinking? Not like that, but just resigned despair. Because it has, let me exemplify it. Early on, there's a section where you go into a kind of a catacomb, and there are 4 doors, and 3 of those doors are the same bonus room with different backgrounds. I'm not joking. And it's not even a bonus room because it's pish hard like every other friggin' room in the game. But one of the doors just kills you. You open it, you fall down, and you die. It's just a trap. And you'll kind of be like, well, why did they put that in? Is this because this is from the era where you in the playground, your mates would just be like, yeah, don't ever go in that door because you'll just die, or you just figure out for yourself, then you tell your friends as if they're buying the Addams Family, But, oh man, it is just The whole game is just full of strangeness like that. The first time you go in the house proper, a chandelier falls on you and does like massive damage unless you leave immediately and then go back in which case it doesn't respawn. There's no other way to avoid it, because if you walk out of the way, you won't be quick enough. You'll just take a bit of damage. You go into the sort of armory area, and the first thing that happens is a sword falls off the wall, and if you're moving, you will get hit. It's just real unfair, and yet there's something compelling about that for me, which feeds into the whole kind of massacre genre you get nowadays with things like Kaizo's Mario Brothers and Super Meat Boy. Though this game doesn't have nearly the... It wishes it had the play control of something like Mario Brothers. It does not. It's I can't entirely hate it because it's just so odd and shit. And anyone who knows me knows how I feel about things that are odd and shit. Which is that I like them. So Addams Family on the NES, I don't recommend it at all, but I also do recommend it incredibly highly. Oh wow, this is Addams Family for the Game Boy, and it is remarkably horrible. Like, why did they do it this way? First of all, you've experienced some of the worst sprite flicker I've ever seen in my entire life. And you play as Gomez, much like in the NES game, going through various different areas to rescue the family, the Addams Family, as hence the name. And all the levels are really... basically boring, loads of nothing, of emptiness, and almost no platforming, and all the enemies are just the most generic possible, like spooky ghosts or small bat or spider, and there is nothing happening here in this game. This is the most rudimentary Game Boy waste of a license I've seen in a long time. It is really bad. Maybe when you get a little deeper into it, maybe it gets a little bit better, but I would be absolutely amazed if that were the case. It is a horrible, horrible title that doesn't even have the cursory sort of level of interest that comes from the NES game being so ridiculously unfair. There's nothing to get my teeth into. It's like when I was doing the friggin' Ren and Stimpy games and I didn't even release the episode because they were just all so awful. It's like that, but at least with this series I know that the good ones are coming. I know they're coming. Don't play this one. And finally we reached the Addams Family for the Super Nintendo, which I believe was originally an Amiga game. Broadly very similar Amiga game. It was also released on the Mega Drive. All the versions have very subtle differences, but the basic game layout, style, etc. is the same. This is actually very much like the NES game, but polished and improved in every single conceivable way. It looks really nice. It's not spectacular, but it looks clean. The sprites are very clean. There isn't slowdown that I came across. The platforms are easy to... You can tell what's a platform and what's not. It's just a very solidly put together platform game. Presentation is rather like almost a sort of Metroidvania style thing where there isn't a map and you can't really get lost, but you can choose where you want to go, and you can find extra added health ups by defeating kind of secret bosses, which 2 of them are fairly easy to find, 1 of them isn't. The core of the gameplay is the platforming, and in this game it's been enormously improved. I can see why people would still struggle with some of it, because it is still a little bit slippery, and if you pick up the item that makes you faster, it's even more slippery. But I found the controls responsive, I found the gameplay enjoyable. It's challenging, but you can make it less challenging, obviously. There are one-ups kind of everywhere, and lots of secrets that reward sort of both lateral and kind of outside-of-the-box thinking. I think they might mean the same thing, and I've just made a fool of myself. But there's plenty to find, there's plenty to do and see. It's not a short game. No, actually, that's not true. It is a short game, but it's not too difficult. It's not too easy either. It's a good, pretty much a good challenge, I would say. The challenge level is pretty much spot on. There is a lot of iteration, so you'll always start with one sort of set of obstacles that will then, as you go forward, they will increasingly get more and more demanding, but it doesn't hold your hand really at any point. It's challenging throughout. Every aspect of the game is geared towards playing it. You're never not engaged. Every single screen you have to think carefully about what you're doing, and I rather like that. I think that's rather good. It's got a sort of dry wit to it with the sort of level titles and the little bits of humour in there, like the dialogue when you rescue one of the family members at the end of each stage, and how there's always a little secret area attached to those you win kind of screens. One of the things I enjoy the most, which really to me spells out why I like this game so much, is when you die on the continue screen, if you walk off the continue screen, because there are 2 doors, continue or quit, and if you just go left off the screen, you find a room with 4 one-ups in it, and it's one of those things where it's like, what an obtuse place to put a secret. That's just this game all over. That's this game all over. Or little things like later on when you get to the library, there are books in the background, and every single one has a different title. And one of the book titles is just door, and if you stand in front of it and press up, you go into a hidden, invisible door. Now that's incredibly obvious, but it's one of those things where something that you'd think they wouldn't bother really doing, they did. This is probably, I think this was Ocean who made this, and it's probably their best game, because they have kind of a reputation for making not very good licensed games, but this one I would recommend to anyone. It's a lot of fun. It's got a password system, so you don't have to do the whole thing in one sitting, though it's honestly entirely doable if you set aside a couple of hours, if even that. So yeah, familiarity helps, obviously. I'm very nostalgic for this one, but I do think it has a lot to offer, and I really kind of unreservedly recommend it on whatever system you can play it on. The SNES version is probably the one I favour, which is unusual for me, because normally I lean towards Mega Drive, but they're more or less both the same, but the SNES one is just slightly nicer looking, so I'd give it to that. The play control is identical in both. The only difference is that there are a couple of different rooms, I believe. There's a couple of secret rooms that are different in the Mega Drive one and the SNES one. The Amiga version, you have to press up to jump, so, to hell with that. The TurboGrafx CD Addams Family game is really unusual and, to my mind, kind of obscure. It seems to be a Western style platformer with lots and lots and lots of voice acting and still images from the movie. You play as the lawyer, and you sort of go into the Addams house and play these remarkably sort of flat but not unenjoyable stages. They remind me a little bit of Splatterhouse, where there isn't a huge amount in the way of platforming, but it's mostly just kind of shooting stuff. There's really very little to say about it, because it's an extremely unusual and inscrutable game. It feels like they didn't quite know what they were going for, but it's a lot more fun than that horrible Game Boy game, so I'll give them props for that. There seems to be a sort of quasi choose your own route kind of thing going on, but I wasn't able to get very far into it because it's kind of tricky, and it's one of those things that's going to require some time to get to grips with. It is a simple game, and it's difficult to explain why it's tricky, but it just feels unusual. So I probably will put some more time into it sometime, but no, this one is, if you're in the incredibly specific demographic of owning a TurboGrafx CD, then I suppose you could do worse than checking out the Addams Family. It's definitely a curious game and probably worth your time just on that basis.
Bester? Hey, I thought this was supposed to be all in good fun. You feel okay? Oh boy, this is a weird family. Oh well, I'm sure old Vesta didn't mean anything by it.
Pugsley's Scavenger Hunt for SNES is an odd duck, to be honest. It's not a bad game by my standards, but as long-time Stuart Jam aficionados will know, my standards are interesting. So, it's a direct sequel to the previous SNES Addams Family game, in that it does share a fair number of elements from it. The dollar collectibles, the heart system, several recurring enemies. There's at least one reuse or reorchestrated music track as well. It doesn't retain the sort of quasi-Metroidvania style that game had, but it is still a very expansive game about visiting lots of individual rooms by travelling through doors. And of course the original game was fairly linear anyway in the end. But Pugsley's Scavenger Hunt, for whatever reason, is just so hard. It's such a difficult game, and there's no way to save your progress whatsoever outside of using some sort of cheat cartridge. Or, save states if you're playing it on an emulator today, but we've got to judge it by the way it was originally to be played, in my opinion. It's... As I said, I wouldn't want to call it bad, because I think the individual level designs are are not necessarily unfun. I quite enjoy the challenge of it, but it's one of those challenges that's it would be hard enough if it had good controls, and it doesn't. It has very slippery, unusual player control that it doesn't really stack up that well. The momentum doesn't really make sense, so it's quite easy to make mistakes. And in this game, a mistake is you could be throwing quite a lot of time away. It's a long game. There's only 6 levels, but they're not short. And there's no real difficulty curve. It's basically just rock hard from the beginning, no matter which level you choose. I mean, some are obviously harder than others, but not to any meaningful extent, I would say. So Pugsley's Scavenger Hunt, yeah, it's very strange, and I'm not quite sure what they were getting at with this one. I wish I could recommend it more, and with a couple of minor changes I would be able to, like a password system for me would justify this game, because being able to retain your progress from a completed level, you'd see the challenge as, what it is, a difficult challenge, but the way that it is now, the fact that you have to do the whole thing in one sitting without really making mistakes is just so demanding in a way that even Masook or Kaizo Mario platformers aren't. It's absurd, to be honest, and there really is no way to mitigate that. And it's not just, of course, that the individual levels are inherently difficult, it's that you have to do all of them. I can't stress that enough. That's the problem here. It's not... If there was a way to fragment the experience, and with save states there is, I guess, but with save states you'll just find yourself thinking like, well, why am I doing this? Why am I not playing something else? So it's a very, very, very heavily qualified yes from me, but it's not for everyone, or really, realistically, not for most people, unfortunately. Pugsley's Scavenger Hunt's Game Boy and NES versions I'm just going to cover really quickly, because they're essentially cut down ports of the original SNES Addams Family game, but with Pugsley replacing Gomez as the player character. As a result, they're not bad, they're quite good fun. They are slow and ham-handed compared to the SNES version. They're very much tailored for their respective systems, especially the Game Boy version, which is remarkably playable because of the way it's been sort of redesigned and slowed down. But there's still half measures. If you can get to the SNES version and play that, then you should, because it's better. Mega Drive version 2 in a pinch, but the SNES was the lead platform for that one. If you don't count the original Amiga version, which I don't, because it's not as good as the console ones, unfortunately. Sorry, Amiga stands. The Addams Family values, based on the sequel to the Addams Family movie of the same name, is an extremely boring Zelda clone. I hate calling it a Zelda clone because that's, reductive, but it's actually closer to something like Story of Thor or Beyond Oasis. They're the same game. But it's extremely boring to play, and the character movement of Uncle Fester, who you play as, is just kind of inherently unfun. He's very slow. He doesn't even have 8-way directional walking. It's straight up 4 directionals, and this isn't even like an early release for these consoles. It's a bit shameful. I'm not really sure what they were thinking. The music is muted but atmospheric in that way that Ocean games often were. I suppose you could also compare it to their Jurassic Park game for SNES and Amiga, but that game was actually better despite not being that good itself. Addams Family Value is very meandering like this commentary, to be honest, and not very good. Also like this commentary. I wish I had something more interesting to say about this game, but it hasn't deigned to offer me anything. It's quite nice looking. There are worse games that exist, but I would never choose to play this game. Based on the new Addams Family series, the game of the same name for the Game Boy Color could easily be mistaken for a GBA game. Honestly, it's very graphically impressive, but that's presumably, because I'm no tech expert, but it's presumably some sort of high color mode applied to the backgrounds, because well, actually the sprites don't look bad either, but they do betray it a little bit, as does the aspect ratio being Game Boy. But it's a remarkably impressive looking game with fun animation and very impressive graphics, as I've stated. Unfortunately, it's not that fun to play. It's a sort of point-and-click adventure, but not one of the interesting ones, and it's quite a jerky movement that betrays the otherwise fantastic sort of aesthetics. So no, not an auspicious way to end it, unfortunately, but to my knowledge, they haven't made any other Addams Family games. Hello, thank you very much for watching, and I'm just going to do a little bit of an end blah 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 like I do on Franchise and Lows. If you're waiting for Stuart Jam in the thinking that maybe it's going to go the same way as Video World, where I go, oh, I'm doing it, yeah, I'm definitely going to do it, I can't wait to do it, and then I don't do it, don't worry about that, because Stuart Jam is definitely 100% happening. I did a bunch more of it today, and I hope you're going to enjoy it when it comes out, which shouldn't take too long. I put a trailer out for it that said July or June, and that was foolish. I should never promise a date like that, because I can rarely stick to it. A bunch of bad stuff has happened, but nothing to worry about, nothing super dramatic. It's just prevented me from being in the sort of space where I can make videos. So yeah, that's that's Franchise and Lows 13. I have actually several more lined up, which I may or may not get round to, because I want to put my focus on Stuart Jam, which is coming out when it's done, which should hopefully be soon. Thanks.